Good evening. Welcome to the Latino and American Studies event series. This is our kickoff lecture. My name is Eleonora Bertranu, and I am the director of the program. Along with the program, we run a reading circle that you're still in time to join if you stay tonight after the event and for the next 3 events for a half-hour discussion. You'll receive, you can talk to me after the talk, and we'll sign you up. I am honored to have one of our own students, Edwin Torres, introduce Professor Dennis Beach tonight. Edwin is a junior at St. John's, and he's a double major in political science and history. He's the chair of the Student Affairs Board of the St. John's Senate, and the co-chair of the Cultural Affairs Board, and he keeps very busy. He's also the program coordinator for the Men's Development Institute, and he's an RA. So thank you, Edwin, for introducing Brother Dennis Beach.
First of all, welcome, everyone. So my name is Edwin. I'll be introducing Brother Dennis Beach. Brother Dennis Beach is the assistant professor and chair of the philosophy department at CSB SJU. He first joined the faculty in 1995 and has been a monastic faculty resident in St. John's Storm since 1997. Brother Dennis Beach has traveled to El Salvador, my beautiful home country, with the St. Cloud Sister City delegation and or the Share Foundation over 20 times since 1998. 5 of those trips were with CSB SJU students and has led 2 study abroad trips to Central America. Brother Dennis has been a past member of the board of directors of the Share Foundation, building in New Salvador today from 2002 to 2008, a longtime member and past chair of the St. John's Abbey Justice and Peace Committee. He has presented numerous times of El Salvador's on ethics and solidarity, liberation theology, Catholic social justice teaching, and many other similar topics. Today, Brother Dennis will present on Archbishop Oscar Romero. His presentation will be about both the facts surrounding Archbishop Romero, his life and death in El Salvador. Brother Dennis' experience and understanding of the importance of Archbishop Romero for El Salvador today, for Christians today, and for those who hope to see the oppressed of the world rise out of their oppression. 35 years later, Romero is still the face of spiritual integrity in El Salvador, still alive in the popular church. The presentation will explore the dynamics of his miracle of faith and justice. When I told my parents that I was going to give this introduction today, they wanted me to tell you all a quick message, as my parents actually attended several masses by Archbishop Romero back in the late 70s. So first I'll say it in Spanish, and then I'll say it in English. Hopefully you'll understand the gist of it. If not, then you'll catch the end part. Monseñor Oscar Romero fue la voz del pueblo salvadoreño, guía espiritual, pero ante todos un ser humano. Un hombre del pueblo con su voz aclamaba por la libertad de expresión, por la justicia, por la igualdad laboral sufrida por el pueblo salvadoreño. Archbishop Romero was the voice of the people of El Salvador, a spiritual guidance, but above all, a human being. A man of the people, and with this voice he fought for freedom, for justice, for labor equality suffered by the people of El Salvador. And it's my pleasure to welcome someone who deeply cares about my country of El Salvador. Please give a warm welcome to Brother Dennis Beach.
So I hope that this lapel seems to be working. And sort of a little bit in the dark here so that this isn't too much in the light. There's like going to be a little happy medium between them. The first thing I'm going to say is I know sometimes people are concerned about catching buses back, and I just say I hope you're not planning to catch the 7:45 bus back. That won't work. And so, but I can pretty much promise you can catch the 8:15 bus. So sometimes I think our students leave lectures a little bit quickly and maybe even a little bit rudely. So we're gonna not do that tonight, I hope, and in this whole series. As Edwin said, I'm going to talk about some historical facts, but also about my experiences in El Salvador. Because that seems to be the clearest and simplest route to understanding Romero's significance for popular religion. Those of you that speak Spanish or that can guess at Latin roots probably readily understand that popular religion, or religión popular, is the religion of the people, religion as people practice it. In popular religion, people are primarily producers of religion and not just consumers of it. For those who need some basic facts, let's start with those. Oscar Romero was named Archbishop of San Salvador, the capital of the small Central American country of El Salvador. The red one there, very small, smaller than the state of Massachusetts, in 1977. He was assassinated by right-wing forces as he was saying Mass on March 24th, 1980, just barely over 3 years later. In 1977, El Salvador had been sliding towards civil war for years, if not decades, because of the vast gap between the small oligarchy of landowners and business families and the landless peasants or campesinos and other working class people. And I'm going to use this word campesinos shamelessly. It sounds better than peasants and people in El Salvador that live in the countryside and they're all farmers. They raise their own crops and fruit and things. They'll say soy campesino. So it's no big deal. It's what they are, rural, just rural folks. With Romero's murder, the threat of civil war became a reality that lasted for a dozen years, from 1980 until 1992. During this entire time, the United States supported the military government and later the pseudo-democratically elected civil government of El Salvador, both of which opposed the popular church and rebel groups. The U.S. supported them to the tune of about $1 million a day. At the height of the war, $1.5 million a day. After the war, the UN Truth Commission attributed some 85% of the human rights abuses during the war, including the assassination of Archbishop Romero, to those aligned with the Salvadoran government. The military, security forces, Guardia Nacional, and death squads. Only 5% of the abuses were attributed to the guerrilla groups, with some 10% unable to be clearly accounted for or attributed. Twice I have traveled to El Salvador for the anniversary of Archbishop Romero's assassination. It always comes smack dab in the middle of spring semester. I did it in the 20th anniversary in the year 2000, and again in 2005, both times with groups of CSB SJU students whose teachers were a bit put out that they were missing classes for about a week. Thought we could go over spring break, but that's not when they do it. There are a lot of events surrounding the whole week leading up to the anniversary on March 24th, and these events always end with a large outdoor mass on the plaza of El Salvador del Mundo, which is the patron of El Salvador. After Mass, there is a procession from the plaza to the cathedral downtown. It's only about 2.25 miles, but the procession is large, an estimated 30,000 people in 2005. I never heard the numbers for 2010. No, 2005. I didn't hear the number for 2000. And it's slow. They're in no hurry. And they stay there in front of the cathedral, some of them all night. The procession begins spread across the wide Alameda Franklin Delano Roosevelt. El Salvador has a long tradition of relations with the United States, which narrows into West 2nd Street. Sounds like it could be in St. Cloud as it gets east into downtown. These are in the very front here, St. John's and St. Ben's students. Not the guy with the mustache over there, but the big beard. That's Gabe Behrens from La Crosse, Wisconsin, Mara Sullivan, and Joe Steingraber, also from La Crosse back there. Besides the candles or farolitos, people and groups carry posters and banners, often with Romero's picture and a quotation from one of his homilies. There are pickup trucks with loudspeakers jockeying for position at regular intervals, and these often lead the crowd, or at least segments of it, in calls or chants. In 2000, my Spanish wasn't very advanced, but I already did know that when someone says "que viva alguien," it means long live someone. But figuratively, it's more like hooray for someone. And however, Que Viva Romero sounded a little bit more like a prayer or a wish there. And then I began hearing another chant that it took me a little bit longer to catch on to. It was repeated over and over again. Resucitó, resucitó, resucitó. This means he is risen. And it is used of Christ at Easter, which is never very far away from March 24th. If you speak Spanish, you know that this accented O at the end of a verb indicates the simple past, the preterite, which is used for something that has definitely happened. He arose. That's what they're saying about Romero. But this wasn't just an identification of Romero with the risen Christ, although that certainly is part of the popular feeling on this assassination anniversary every year. And the big years are the 5th year ones, but they do it every year. They're preparing this year for the 35th. One of the most often cited quotations of Romero is this: "If they kill me, I will rise again in the Salvadoran people." He said this in an interview, one of the few quotations that's not from a homily. It was in an interview about 2 weeks before he was killed. One often sees this saying painted on walls or printed on posters. It's one of 2 popular sayings of Romero inscribed on either side of the entrance to the chapel in his memory and honor that was built by the Jesuits next to their residence at the University of Central America, Jesuit College. I can't see it this way at the angle, but one is on one side, one is on the other. And I think if I click again, you can see that si me matan, resucitaré en el pueblo salvadoreño. To hear this chant, resucitó, 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 he is arisen, he is arisen, he is arisen, rising itself in waves from the lips of 30,000 people marching to the cathedral, their faces lit not only with candlelight, but with Romero's spirit. This struck me as a profound truth. Romero really was alive, and alive just as he prophesied he would be, in the Salvadoran people. But let me backtrack to the first topic on my talk, conversion. It's often said that Oscar Romero was chosen to succeed the beloved and sort of gently progressive Archbishop Luis Chavez because Romero was a conservative. 1977 was a time of social tension. Social tensions were running high, and a number of Catholic priests had been strongly influenced not only by Vatican II's populism, but by the Medellin, Colombia Conference of the Latin American Bishops in 1968 and the liberation theology agenda it had advocated. On the one hand, however, Romero was not simply a conservative, if we give that word the meaning it has today in Catholic church circles. He was enthusiastic about the pastoral teachings of Vatican II, about the use of diocesan newspapers and radio as modern means of communication and part of the signs of the times. So he wasn't rebelling at all against Vatican II. Romero fully supported Vatican II's pastoral teaching about the church in the modern world, which was for him exactly what Vatican II called it, a message of gaudium et spes, joy and hope. What he didn't seem to see yet was the darkness and despair out of which that joy and hope were to be born, at least in El Salvador. Now, Romero did oppose the secular and even revolutionary rhetoric that had come to be used in many of the grassroots parish communities, the base Christian communities in El Salvador. And even that name, base Christian communities in Spanish, Comunidades Eclesiales de Base, is kind of a Marxist name. You know, the base kinds of things. It's like the collectives in the Soviet Union or sort of a thing. But that's what they called themselves. As auxiliary bishop of San Salvador, Romero was named editor of the archdiocesan newspaper, Orientación. Under his leadership, the paper published an editorial denouncing a certain high school for pedagogy and demagoguery of a false liberating education, that's a quotation, which the paper claimed was not Medellin's liberating education, again a quote, but an inculcation of Marxism, using, quote, pamphlets and literature of known red origin. The high school referred to was not a secret. It was the premier Jesuit high school in the city, the Externado San Jose. This school had recently begun curricular innovations featuring ideas from Medellin. And in the Latin American church world, Medellin is a turning point. People say after Medellin, when the bishop said, how do we make Vatican II happen in our place? So the new curriculum in the high school featured ideas from Medellin aimed at helping students come to recognize and know the reality of poverty as a type of institutionalized violence opposed to the gospel of Christ. This is exactly the teaching of Medellin, if you read the documents. Evening classes at the high school were begun for children of poor families who could not afford the tuition charged to the well-to-do families of the day students. This arrangement became standard practice in many formerly exclusive private Catholic schools in Latin America. Field trips visited barrios where the poorest of the poor lived, and the revolutionary pedagogy of Paulo Freire was voiced not only in the curriculum, but in the school's publications. All of this made Romero suspicious that this method of education was not gospel-based, but Marxist, and this is what his editorial denounced. Now, the national papers, the secular press, took up Orientacion's critique of the school as if it were the official position of the church, which angered Romero's boss, Archbishop Chavez. You don't want to anger your boss if he's an archbishop. Chavez formed an investigatory commission which exonerated the high school completely, and then he instructed Romero, the editor, to publish this exoneration in Orientación, which is essentially a rebuke of the editorial stance that Romero had advocated. The Jesuit University's magazine, ECA, or Estudios Centroamericanos, Central American Studies, still I don't know if it used to be online, you could get the current editions, it's still there, but there's nothing really current, then published its own review of the diocesan paper Orientación, and it painted the paper as inconsistent. Quote, the paper criticizes injustice in the abstract, but criticizes methods of liberation in the concrete. ECA said that Orientación timidly defended the established order and was aimed at a reading public complacent about present injustices. These issues and others like them are at the heart of the usual characterization of Romero as a candidate who was named Archbishop in El Salvador because Rome wanted a conservative. And it is true that the person who had been auxiliary bishop longer than him, Archbishop Rivera y Damas, was more on the progressive side. And ironically, he's the one that became Archbishop after Romero was assassinated. The story goes that Romero then was converted to a more radical stance, embracing the very liberation theologies that he had earlier found suspect. But this paints the story as if it were an ideological battle, which I don't think it really was, although ideological battles were going on at the time. Romero himself always challenged the idea that he underwent a radical conversion, saying, "What happened in my priestly life, I have tried to explain to myself as an evolution." Now, the Jesuit theologian John Sobrino, one of the few Jesuits not to be assassinated in 1989, because he was giving a talk in Thailand, and this Sobrino, Romero had implied was one of those teaching the so-called new Christologies in a homily given just 6 months before he became Archbishop, Sobrino has acknowledged that Romero did not particularly like to hear his change referred to as a conversion. And he had a point, Sobrino writes. Nevertheless, Sobrino, in the same page, goes on to call Romero's change a radical change. And a few paragraphs later is perfectly comfortable calling it a definitive conversion. But if Sobrino is right that Romero had a point in preferring evolution to conversion, what is that point? Well, first of all accounts of him seem to agree that Romero had always been close to the poor. Born into humble poverty himself, as a young priest in San Miguel, Romero had lived very simply and paid special attention to the poor. During his 2-year stint as Bishop of Santiago de Maria, it's an eastern rural diocese, which include the small town of Romero's childhood, Romero went to visit, console, and say Mass at the small hamlet of Tres Calles immediately after a middle-of-the-night National Guard raid there shot and hacked to death with machetes 5 campesinos. When Romero went to complain, the local commander dismissed the campesinos as malefactors, just evildoers, bad guys. That Romero then wrote a letter to President Molina expressing anger and anguish, though with deference and respect, as his biographer, Jesuit James Brockman, says. That he did this shows that he was willing to denounce injustice and human rights abuses before the time of his so-called conversion, that he recognized them as such, but that he did not yet comprehend how far-reaching and corrupt the entire system of oppression was. He thought he could go to the president or people higher up and they would correct what was happening on the ground. It was not long before Romero would learn how false and credulous this wishful thinking was. One other side note, I had a footnote that I missed at the top of the page. Sobrino's account of the homily that says the so-called new Christologies is different. In Sobrino's book, he says, I didn't attend that Mass, but one of the Jesuits had a tape recorder and recorded it, and Romero started his homily by talking about the rationalistic, revolutionary, and hate-filled Christologies. Now, I think that the biographer and his other sources quote exactly what he said, so-called new Christologies, but this tells you how much this criticism stung John Sobrino, is he heard exactly what was being said by other people reflected in Romero's words. Another thing that virtually all studies and remembrances of Romero emphasize is his personableness and humility. There is a book called, let's see, what is it called in English? In Spanish, it's Monsignor Romero, Piezas por un Retrato, and in English, it's Memories in Mosaic. And it's about a lot of people that just worked with him, telling the stories of what they remember him doing. And it's got all the accuracy that you would expect of oral history years later. But you do learn some things there about him, and this is his personableness is, even though he said he was awkward himself. I read Brockman's biography says that he was diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder. I don't know how you could have that if you're hanging out in the rural areas of El Salvador. You have to get over it pretty quickly. And he loved hanging out there, as we'll see. One gets the sense that even in his critiques of secular and Marxist ideologies, he was parroting someone else's line. If pushed on whether his criticism referred to specific individuals, Romero likely would, and at times did say, no, of course I don't mean that Father X is a communist. Now, one could suspect that Romero was simply being hypocritical if he offered this excuse, but even those like Sobrino who feared his rising conservative star, and he was kind of rising, that's how he was named Archbishop, they refused to charge him with this kind of duplicity. They said he wasn't talking out of both sides of his mouth that way. He saw people a different way than he saw the issues, and there's a sense that he didn't look at the issues all that deeply. At least those particular issues. But the best evidence of this attitude was Romero's fast friendship with Father Rutilio Grande, a Jesuit who was one of the leading proponents of the liberation theology-based Christian community model. They had come to know each other when they both worked at the seminary in San Salvador in the 1960s, although in 1972, Romero himself was named the rector of the seminary as a deliberate ploy to keep the left-leaning Grande from being named the rector of the seminary, and Grande was the most obvious candidate by both talent and training. The seminary more or less foundered under Romero, but neither he nor Grande recriminated one another about this. If the Spanish would say, fracasó. It fell apart completely. Okay? It got really small. They had to actually close the minor seminary, move those people in. They were losing money. but they still remain friends. In this picture, the one on the left is the Archbishop Chavez, Luis Chavez. Romero, and this is the day he was ordained an auxiliary bishop in 1970. Rivera, who became Archbishop after Romero but was auxiliary before, is the third one over. And the MC is Father Rutilio Grande. Okay, so that illustrates the thing I just said. Rutilio Grande, in this picture, was personally asked by Romero to be the master of ceremonies for his ordination of bishop in 1970. Oh, actually, I think I'm still back on this slide. Some sources say that he was also when he was installed as the bishop of the diocese and as archbishop, but I didn't find anything to corroborate that. Okay. The usual story is that Romero had concerns that Rutilio's vision and methods as a pastor were too horizontal. Get Rutilio back up there. Meaning, by horizontal, too much concerned with this world and not enough with heaven, and too tied to worldly, social, and political ideas, especially Marxist analysis. While it is true that these were Romero's expressed concerns about some priests who followed the liberation theology Medellin line, and the books, the sources say, especially in Suchitoto, which was a kind of on the borderline of the guerrilla territory, although so was Aguilares, where Grande was, he seems to have known Rutilio Grande better and simply trusted him more. And this represents a little bit more the kind of pastor he was. It's well known that all of this came to a crisis point very shortly after Romero was named Archbishop on February 22nd, 1977. Salvadoran church and society was in a state of high tension, and several priests had been expelled from the country for fostering seditious ideas. And so on March 12th, so February's a short month, so 6 days left after he's named Archbishop, and another 12 days, less than 3 weeks, 2.5 really, Rutilio Grande and two companions, a 16-year-old altar boy and an older man who served as sacristan, both of them campesinos, were ambushed and killed by machine gun fire as they were driving from the rural town of Aguilares, where Rutilio Grande was pastor, to the small hamlet of El Paisnao for Saturday evening Mass. And if you've seen the movie Romero, that's depicted. That changes some things to make it more sort of dramatic, but I always thought that they were killed while they were walking, but no, I found out it really was in a Volkswagen Jeep of kind. This was clearly the work of a death squad. And I thought there were pictures out there of the bodies as they were discovered, but I couldn't find any. What this is a display case, in the same picture we saw, at the Museum of the Martyrs at the UCA, the University of Central America in San Salvador, the Jesuit university. And what you have is Rutilio and all his belongings that he had with him when he was killed. And most of them are all full of bullet holes. You can tell they're machine gun holes because it's just a row of holes. And that's his shirt that he was wearing. The blood is still clearly recognizable as blood. I don't know if you can see it there. On my computer, you can clearly see the dark red stain showing through. And it's the back of his shirt. It's fairly clear that he received most of the bullets from the back and the side. They also have a place where the Jesuits, when they were killed, they have where their blood's soaked into the sand and gravel. They just put that in glass jars and have it there. They think it's very important to verify that these bloody deeds happened, and so they preserve that. Romero was called by phone and showed up in Aguilares the same evening at the Jesuit house. Sobrino's the one that met him at the door. They went to the church, and without saying much, Romero celebrated Mass with all those assembled, priests, sisters, local parishioners, campesinos, in the presence of the three bullet-riddled bodies, still bullet-riddled. And this was not the funeral Mass. This was just, hey, what do? First thing we do is say Mass. After the Mass, Romero asked as many as could to stay and help him decide how to respond to this event. Again, priests, sisters, church workers, ordinary campesinos, without drawing any distinction among them. And Sobrino was clear this was Romero who asked this. This kind of trust in the people who made up the church, the popular church, would come to characterize Romero's all too brief episcopacy. That's a fancy word for the time he was a bishop. Instead of telling people what to think from an ideological standpoint, Romero was sincerely asking for help in understanding what must be done. Whether or not this was a complete reversal of his earlier course, this manifest attitude of Romero, his so-called conversion, came to be known as Rutilio's miracle. And if you want to make someone a saint, you got to find miracles you can attribute to them, and that's part of what was saying there. But they did say this is Rutilio behind this. The actual funeral for Father Rutilio and his companions was 2 days later, the 14th of March, a Monday. He was killed going to say Sunday Mass, the Saturday afternoon Mass, actually. And so they didn't do the funeral on Sunday, did it on Monday. Romero, of course, preached the homily, and he did talk in the homily about the danger of purely secular and political understanding of liberation. However, his homily denied that this was Rutilio's vision. Instead, he emphasized that Rutilio himself, and if you travel to El Salvador, you stop calling him Father Grande pretty quick. You call him Rutilio, or as they called him, Padre Tilo in Aguilares. Romero emphasized that Rutilio himself made this distinction about the religious versus the political liberation, and had chosen the religious way, even though Rutilio also, in his very own words in an essay published shortly before he was killed, said he agreed with the objective of the secular way. He doesn't say not the method, but he emphasized he was agreeing with the objective. In his funeral homily, Romero underlined this religious dimension of Rutilio's liberation, and this is a long quote. The liberation that Father Grande preached is inspired by faith, a faith that speaks to us about eternal life, a faith that he, with his face raised toward heaven and accompanied by 2 campesinos, offered up in its totality and perfection. Liberation which culminates with happiness with God. Liberation which brings about a repentance for sin. Liberation based on Christ, the only saving power. This is the liberation that Father Rutilio Grande preached. Now, did friendship lead Romero to judge Rutilio Grande leniently and to be harsher toward others? Perhaps. But the change, whether it was a conversion or an evolution, went beyond just this. Romero discussed with the Jesuits immediately several responses they could take to this new escalation in the persecution of the church, the intimidation of the popular church. The most dramatic thing they did was to cancel all local Sunday Masses in the Archdiocese on the following Sunday. Sounds like an odd thing for a Catholic archdiocese to do, is cancel all the Masses, except one, in favor of a single large-scale Mass. In Spanish was called La Misa Única, at the cathedral and the large plaza, because they wouldn't fit in the cathedral, in front of the... In every Latin American town where you have a church, you have a large plaza in front of it. Well, small towns, it's a small plaza, but it's always there. This decision did not come easy to Romero, but he came to believe it. They said when it was talked about, he just listened for a long time. And not only resisted, but repudiated the papal nuncios, the Pope's representatives, angry criticism of the plan. And this is what I said, when he came in, he was denouncing it, and actually at the meeting talking about it, Romero just was silent, and they said, well, you can't do this, is against canon law, and it wasn't against canon law. The bishop has that authority, and Romero, he waited till everybody had said, he says, I'm the Archbishop, there will be one Mass. Very quietly. The original idea might have been the Jesuits. The backbone that made the single Mass a powerful, successful reality was Romero's. Now, the idea of the single Mass for the whole Archdiocese was to effect a symbolic expression of the Church's unity and to protest not only the violence it was suffering, but the violence and oppression that poor and vulnerable campesinos and workers suffered everywhere in El Salvador. Christ taught that if you do violence to the least of my brothers and sisters, you do it to me. And Romero essentially made the same point in the homily, emphasizing that not only the violence done to the poor and the vulnerable, but to the priests and religious who were serving them pastorally. Whoever touches one of these, Romero says, touches me. Romero also demanded an immediate investigation by the government and said he would not participate in any official government functions, which is the traditional role of the country's archbishop, until the perpetrators had been brought to justice. This never happened. There was never a real investigation. As one theologian writes today, just in an article published last year, the bullets are still in the corpses. Nobody did any investigation of things. And Romero never participated in a government function in his 3 years as Archbishop. In retrospect, what really happened that week of the funeral and the single mass is that the Salvadoran church was reborn as the People's Church, with Romero as its clear leader, its shepherd. Just 3 months later, in June 19th, after the parish church at Aguilares had been occupied by the Salvadoran military and the consecrated host taken out of the tabernacle and desecrated, Romero celebrated a rededication mass installing a new Jesuit priest, in which he there preached to the campesinos who had been terrified for a solid month by the army occupation. Trying to give back to them, Sobrino says, at least their dignity and suffering. Romero said to them in the homily, "You are the image of the divine victim, pierced for our offenses." That's a liturgical thing from the Good Friday liturgy. This preaching identifies the poor and oppressed as the body of Christ, and thus follows the theology of Jürgen Moltmann, a Protestant German theologian, wrote a book called The Crucified God, a well-read copy of which is still on Romero's bookshelf in the little residence that has been turned into a museum. With this proclamation of them as the body of Christ, Romero not only made clear his preferential option for the poor, but made of the Catholic Church in El Salvador a church of the poor. The campesinos who heard this homily were not theologians, but they heard Romero perfectly. They were the image of Christ, and their persecution and suffering was the suffering of Christ today in history. According to John Sobrino, one of the other priests who was present that day, after Mass they then held a procession of the Blessed Sacrament out of the church and into the plaza. The Feast of Corpus Christi is in June, had just passed. They weren't able to have their Corpus Christi procession because the church was occupied by the military. And a feast day without a procession in Latin America, it doesn't really count as a feast day. When I was on the Costa Rica Study Abroad program, we used to have one there. My family asked me, Lent was starting, to say, "What do you do in Minnesota for Lent? What kind of processions do you have?" And I said, "Well, we don't really have any processions." And my host mother just went, "Oh, like, you're heathens. How could you do that?" And her daughter had to kind of calm her down, etc. But so they were going to have this procession. As they came out of the church, Sobrino recounts this, across the plaza in front of the town hall, there were armed troops standing there watching us, sullen, arrogant, unfriendly. The procession wavered as it neared that town hall, always across the plaza. And those in front looked back to Archbishop Romero, who was carrying the monstrance with the consecrated host in it. And Romero just said, "Adelante," forward. If the Jesuits thought that until that moment they were leading and Romero was following, that completely changed. Sobrino writes, "Nothing of any importance happened in our country over the next 3 years without all of us turning to Archbishop Romero for guidance and direction, for leadership." Well, these should go on their own for a while. Sobrino ends this reflection on the change manifested in Romero in the very first months of his time as Archbishop by noting that what really cemented Romero's understanding of the gospel was his closeness with the suffering people, the poor campesinos of El Salvador. Romero continuously spoke genuinely in reaching out to the poor, in validating their experience and in validating their cries for justice. And they accepted him quite simply and wholeheartedly. Sobrino writes that in El Salvador, before the church ever made an option for the poor had made an option for the church. It seems that Romero realized this in a special way when he witnessed the intense suffering of the people, which seems to have drawn them to the church almost as a last resort. Sobrino remarks that he and some of his fellow Jesuits believed that the poor were important as well, but they maybe believed it in a more theoretical way. Romero, he says, bore witness to the gospel truth of the poor in the gospel action of loving them and allowing them to love him, but probably in the reverse order. Allowing them to love him, and that drew out his love of them. But he did that already when he was Bishop of Santiago de Maria. Romero himself talked about how close he was to the Salvadoran people. He spent the next 3 years visiting the simple people in the countryside and the poor barrios of the cities and towns. In one homily, he said, and this is getting closer to the end of his life, "How it delights me in humble villages when the people and the children come crowding around. Or you arrive at the town and they come out to meet you. They come with trust because they know that you are bringing them God's message." Probably the best known quotation from Romero's homilies to illustrate this attitude of how his church was the Iglesia Popular, the church of the people, the church of the poor, is the other phrase spelled out at the entrance to the chapel the Jesuits made to commemorate him at the UCA. We saw the earlier one. And that's the Spanish, "Con este pueblo no cuesta ser buen pastor." With this people, it is not hard to be a good shepherd. And you see this everywhere. Romero became known as a preacher. Immediately, his words gained currency. He didn't shout or reach for dramatic effects, but his homilies were electric, and in more ways than one. The Archdiocese had a radio station, YSAX, which was bombed in late 1979. Although donations immediately came flooding in to buy a new transmitter. One of the stories that's told is a taxi driver was going through San Salvador and the Archbishop was coming out of the cathedral heading to something, and the taxi driver just pulled over, rolled down his window, and handed Romero 5 colones for the radio. So, the people wanted to hear these things. So, this radio station broadcast all his Sunday homilies, and people still, when you talk to them, and they recount how on Sunday morning you could walk down the streets of any village and hear every single word of the homily, his voice coming from doorway after doorway. The homilies would often last an hour or more and would include news of persecutions and kidnappings and murders of ordinary campesinos or other pastoral activities, positive news too. The campesinos who suffered this was mostly members of rural churches, all the things that had occurred in the past week. A month after the radio transmitter had been destroyed, it was broadcasting again when Romero gave his most famous homily on March 23rd, 1980. It is his most famous homily because it was his last Sunday homily and his second to last overall since he was killed the next day. I think the movie shows him being killed in the cathedral, which is false. And I'll show you where he was killed in just a second. It is almost impossible not to think that what he said at the end of the homily, and he says it in the name of this suffering people, was the final straw for the government, in effect, his death sentence. And this, again, is a famous quote, a long quote, and then I'm going to try to play the very last part of it for you. He said at the very end of his homily, "I would like to appeal in a special way to the men of the army, and in particular to the ranks of the Guardia Nacional and the police, those in the barracks. Brothers, you are from our same people. You kill your own campesino brothers and sisters. And before an order to kill that a man may give, God's law must prevail, which says, 'Thou shalt not kill.' No soldier is obliged to obey an order against the law of God. An immoral law no one has to fulfill. It is high time to recover your consciences and to obey your consciences first and not the order of sin. The church, defender of the rights of God, of the law of God, of human dignity, of the person, cannot remain silent before such abomination. We want the government to understand seriously that the reforms are worth nothing, and the government had been doing some reforms, if they come stained with so much blood. In the name of God, then, and in the name of this suffering people whose laments rise to heaven each day more tumultuously, I beg you, I beseech you, I order you, in the name of God, stop the repression." And now let's see if I can make this work. I have the audio can't be integrated, it's in a different website. So if I go here.
En nombre de Dios, pues, y en nombre de este sufrido pueblo, cuyos lamentos suben hasta el cielo cada día más tumultuosos, les suplico, les ruego, les ordeno en nombre de Dios, cese la represión.
Talking goes on for a good while. And in fact, this is a great website. It's got all his homilies, Sunday homilies, and a few others, and in English, but you can listen to the Spanish if you can do that. It's pretty clear that Romero was ordering soldiers to disobey the orders of their military superiors. Of course, he was doing this in the name of God. But this is perhaps what sealed his fate. And if this courageous example of speaking truth to power was his death sentence, it is also one of those messages of Romero that has never died. And I think he would have been killed anyway if he hadn't done that. It was the occasion of it, but it was not the cause. The circumstances of Romero's death are well known. He was saying Mass, an afternoon Mass, at the chapel of the Hospitalito Divina Providencia, Divine Providence Cancer Hospital, little hospital, Hospitalito, where he also lived. The Archbishop's residence had been damaged, so they gave him a place to live, and it was pretty humble. He lived in a little set of rooms the sisters gave him. The Mass marked the one-year anniversary of the death of a mother of a friend of his, a journalist. Late March in Central America and El Salvador is the hottest time of the year, late March into April, and not many places have air conditioning. The doors of the church were standing wide open. And I don't know if you can quite see there. This is looking directly into the church, probably the exact view that the sniper had. The gospel, as would be natural for memorial Mass, was, unless a grain of corn falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a grain of corn. If you're in El Salvador, there's no grains of wheat. They're all grains of corn. Okay, and I think the word in the scripture is a grain, and a granito is a grain of corn. That's just the way it is. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. And of course, Romero's homily reflected this message, and this whole thing is absolutely symbolic to the people today. After he finished his homily, Romero moved behind the altar, which we see there, to begin the offertory. The way I was told the story by Sister Rosa, Madre Rosa, is that Romero, as the prayer goes, opens his hands to begin the prayer over the gifts, what are being offered as a sacrifice. When he opened his hands, he kind of framed it, and he took immediately a bullet in the heart, as if he framed the shot. And he kind of bent over a little bit as if he was praying, and then fell backwards, bleeding from his ears, his eyes, his nose, his mouth, and of course from his chest. Now the reason he was bleeding from his ears, his eyes, his nose, and his mouth is it was a hollow point bullet, which is also why he bent forward. It went through him and then expanded against his backbone, which pushed him forward, and then fell backwards. And of course the concussion of all that pushed the blood out. There are photos you can find on the internet, and I thought I would spare us. Right. He died almost instantly. But now I want to return to my beginning and the chant, Resucitó, Resucitó, Resucitó. He is arisen, He is arisen, He is arisen. My argument for why this is true is simple. This year, 2015 marks the 35th anniversary of Romero's assassination, and although there are large commemorations every year, as I said, the 5-year milestones are even bigger. And especially more people come from other countries, huge numbers from the U.S. And they will again chant, Resucitó, Resucitó, Resucitó. There'll be a new poster, and people will repaint some murals. Beyond this, Romero's face and his words are heard not just on the 24th of March, but they're heard every day and seen every day everywhere in El Salvador. His words and his face are mounted on buildings, as we've seen. They're also printed on posters and painted as murals on walls, hung on banners in church. These testify to Archbishop Romero's being alive today in the popular church, the popular liberation movements, in the cries of the poor who demand justice. Now I'm going to just let a number of slides kind of run, but then I'm going to come back with one final commentary. I provide some translations. I translated that for you once, so you got to get it now. Some more informal. They love this one. Longer one. Obviously, this is not posted in El Salvador in English. I had to double check that the quote was Romero and not Che. This is done by an American, Melissa Bangs. I know her. This is an American. He's a religious, I forget what order. This is anti-free trade. You're never going to get all that read in the few seconds I give you. But this is the homily we just heard. That one is worth looking at in detail, but I'm not going to. I could go back to it if people want to. I think this is my last one. All right. This is the thing that we saw before, the interior of Divina Providencia. But it's a side view, and it's a side view deliberately. I took this photo in 1998 on my first trip to El Salvador. And I was ransacking my brains to remember the Spanish that I had quit taking as a junior in high school. And in 1998, I was 42 years old. So 17 years old was a long time in the rearview mirror. But I was sitting in the pew here, as you can see the angle, and looking at this plaque. And as you can see, there's a little blank space here. And I kept looking, I was reading it, and I could make it out. I was probably thumbing through my dictionary. And I said, there's a word missing. The sentence doesn't end. And so Madre Rosa, who was not there, her sister, who was also, these are missionary Carmelite sisters, was there. And I think it was her father that was there too. But Madre Rosa always gave for the groups that would come to visit. She always told them about things. She was there in 2001 with us with a group of CSBSJU students in January when we had a 7.6 earthquake. And the students are all Midwesterners, know about tornadoes, don't know a darn thing about earthquakes, and just sat in the pews of the church while the pews are hopping up and down around us. And afterwards, Madre Rosa says, "Oh, your faith impressed me so much. You knew that Monsignor would preserve you," and nobody got up and ran out of the church. And we're thinking, Madre Rosa, if we knew we were supposed to get up and run out of church, we would have been right out the door right away, etc. But anyway, it's actually an A-frame kind of building, so it's actually pretty secure. If it gets damaged, it'll fall into itself. But so I said, Madre Rosa, and I had to say this in English. Now I could do it in Spanish. I said, you know, the plaque there, it's obviously an anniversary plaque, and it, let's see what the next slide has here that I have for it. Yeah, you can see it better there. There's a word missing. You can't read it there, but it says, "No one has greater love than the one who lays down his life for his friends. As an offering of daughterly love to Monsignor Oscar Arnulfo Romero on the 7th anniversary of his blank." And I looked at that blank, and I said, and it was pretty black, and I said, that word is too long to be death, muerte, and it's too short to be asesinato, assassination. So what is it? And she looked at me and says, the word is martirio, martyrdom. Exactly in between death and assassination. And I said, well, what happened? She says, well, someone told someone, and someone came from Rome. And they said, only Rome can declare a martyr. And so they made us cover it up with this black stuff. So the next year I went back to El Salvador, and now I was co-leader of the trip. Mary Geller, VP for Student Development at St. Ben's, went. Another teacher at St. Ben, St. John's Peace Studies, Vera Acarius Kelly, who's now at Siena College in New York. She and her husband Bill, who was the soccer coach at St. Ben's, went. Dave Johnson, who was campus ministry at St. John's, went. And well, actually, before that, we walked from, I'm skipping one part of it, we walked from the church where the word martyrdom is covered up. And they unlocked this gate, and this is the entrance into the little house where he lived. And it says, Monsignor Romero, prophet and martyr. And I asked Sister Rose, I said, did they change their mind? And she says, we didn't invite him in here. and so what it says in the small print, it's hard to read, los pobres te llaman sin prevenir el juicio de la iglesia. The poor call you this, prophet and martyr, without preventing, or it actually can mean waiting for, the judgment of the church. And I think that's kind of where his canonization status is. The church can do, and they would be very much in favor of it, but they're not in doubt. Okay? So then a year later I go back, and I'm going to show everybody, you got to see this, where they won't let him call him a martyr and things and stuff like that. I've told them all about it. And so we look at the plaque. Where is it? And this line, on the 7th anniversary of his martyrio. See how covered up it is? It's not covered up at all. So I got to raise my hand and ask Madre Rosa again, ¿Qué pasó? What happened? Did Rome change their mind? She says, no. But the people, they come and everybody takes their uña and little by little, it just disappears. And she was smiling broadly, etc. And but actually, not very long after that, Pope John Paul II went to Central America. He was in Guatemala, and he gives a homily, is a canonization of a saint, and he talks about Romero. And he calls Romero a martyr. Popes don't do that casually. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew that his papal nuncio back in 1977 had blackballed Romero and painted him as simply a slave to the communists. And Pope John Paul II reprimanded Romero. He wasn't Pope yet in 77. He'd just become, first visit that he went there, he saw Pope Paul VI. But the next two were John Paul II. And in his first one, John Paul II scolded him or was cool towards him and asked about, you got to be careful with your preaching, etc. And he later admitted and says that he was fed a line about Romero. It's just one of the things that seems to be necessary to say. So I didn't quite actually, that's all ad lib on the end here. That's what I've got. My claim is that he's still very much alive today. And it strikes me in this week too is in the way that Martin Luther King is alive in a sense, not a biological sense, but more people have heard Martin Luther King's speech than the thousands that were assembled on the mall than originally heard it. And that was big, and Romero's too, but his words and his face are everywhere. So that's what I've got to say, and I'm willing to take questions, and I think we can ask a few questions, and you can still skedaddle to a bus if you need to do that. Okay? So, any questions that people would like to ask? Elizabeth. Okay. And I was doing this on the Popular Church, and last year I gave a presentation in January, and not a whole lot of people saw it because it was 26 degrees below zero. And we had just announced that everything was closed. There were going to be no classes the next day, etc. And so the buses were closing down and such things. But I did talk about that. The church today, the Popular Church is still alive and going strong in many places. Where it was strong, it still is strong. The official leadership of the church, the Archbishop, has not been a positive Archbishop ever since Rivera-Damas after Romero, and he died of cancer in, I think, the very late 80s, before the war was over. The current Archbishop is a big problem. He closed the human rights legal office that Romero opened. Just, they showed up for work one day and there were locks on the doors. Nobody knows what has happened to the archives of that. There are pages, and it's as organized as any office in a church office in El Salvador is, which means completely disorganized. But there are pages and pages and pages and folders of testimonial of campesinos who came and said, and this is what they did. They came in the middle of the night, they grabbed my husband, dragged him out, and macheting him in front of the children. And there are pages of that stuff. Nobody knows what's happened to it. He was angry at them because they took the case of Romero to the Central American court, and he didn't want them to. He also had removed from the facade of the cathedral, and I showed this last year, so I've got slides on it, the mural that Salvadoran artist Fernando Yort from La Palma in the very north, Chalatenango in El Salvador, had put up after Romero died, but it was a typical Salvadoran, the People's Church kind of scenes, a lot of the kind of things that you can buy crosses with these kind of motifs on it. And all of a sudden scaffolding went up in canvas and they thought, oh, they're cleaning it. And all of a sudden a rain of tiles comes down and there's in total in shreds on the ground. Just ripped it all off the front of the church. A real affront to... And he's an artist of the popular church. I mean, this thing. So what you've got, I think, now in El Salvador is you have the popular church and you have a more traditional church trying to reassert itself. But Romero seems to be beloved by everybody. Protestant clergymen, and the Lutheran bishop there, Medardo Gomez, always was very close. And they got Medardo. After Romero was killed, they said, we got to get Medardo out. He's going to get killed next. So official church relations are very positive. There's also, I think there's been an erosion of how close the popular organizations working for social change, how closely linked they are to the church. When, in the 90s, right after the war ended, they worked hand in glove. They were, the names of the Cryptis was a Christian Committee for the Displaced of El Salvador. And they changed their name now, and there's no Christian in it anymore. And for a while, there was still a Christian spirit in it, and that's kind of evaporated from it now. So it's not the best story, but I actually think in Nicaragua, it's swung even worse to reactionary kind of a thing. Partly because they actually got power there when the Sandinistas took over, and there's a resentment against that. And so there's a much more of an identification of the Sandinistas, which were a communist socialist government, and which is not a hugely bad thing in everybody's book, but and the popular church in Nicaragua. But you still see it you still see popular expressions. There's much less fear about manifestations coming out in the street and demanding rights and those sorts of things. Still really happen. But you do get a little bit of sad things. But there still are some really good. I mean, I still was 10 years ago taking those pictures in churches. I haven't been there in 5 years. I'm kind of suffering withdrawal. Last time was 2010 with students from Cretan-Durham Hall. They needed an extra chaperone. I said, I'll go. So, any other questions, things people are curious about? Yeah.
What first inspired you to go? Why did you leave?
I was the chair of I had learned about Romero. He became Archbishop when I was a student at St. John's, and I heard about this guy. And then when I was making negotiations to join the monastery is when I was going to join the monastery and then said I got cold feet. The cold feet lasted not even a year, but and I've been here ever since. But I went to Chicago and was teaching, and that's the spring he was killed. But so I knew about him, and then had followed that. But in the monastery, I was kind of got pegged and did things with the social justice thing. And I was the chair of the Justice and Peace Committee, but I was working on my doctorate. I taught high school for my first 10 years in the monastery. And Sister Ann Malerich of the community at St. Ben's had started this in 1992. It was the year the war ended. A group of people got together and said, let's start this Sister City project. And I was the chair of the Justice and Peace Committee, and they would come to me and say, we need a monk to go. And so I would get Brother David Paul, Brother Walter, various different people. And then in 1997, I defended my dissertation for my philosophy degree, And a note was sent to someone at St. Chaplain, I think, took it to St. Ben's. Note went up on the bulletin board. I got a call from Sister Ann, and she said, "Congratulations, you're out of excuses." And so the next summer I went to El Salvador. And I went there, trying to grasp my Spanish back. And on our last day, I can remember, just about in tears, and I said, "This can't be my last trip." And it wasn't. So it's kind of addictive. I had the feeling there, and when I took students there too, we got there, the last group I took was from the study abroad trip in Guatemala, and we got there on March 12th, if you can remember that was one of the dates, on bus in Aguilares, where Rutilio Grande was killed. Every March 12th, the people walk, the pilgrimage to where he was killed, and then they keep going on, because he was killed at the crossroads, they finish going on to El Paisnal, and then there's a big mass. It is hotter than blazes. But we showed up, we're worried if we're going to be late. It had started, but they have all these speeches. We get to the plaza, we get out of the little bus vehicle that's driving us. We get out, all these gringos, and we come out, and they turn, they see, they're all looking at who's speaking, they see it coming, and they just say, "The solidarity is here. The solidarity is here." They're thanking us for coming back. The students said, "We've never been here before." They said, "You aren't yourself. You're not an individual person. You're the North Americans who accompanied them in the camps, refugee camps during the war." And so the experience when you go there, I said, it's like stepping into this social justice stream that's just flowing. And when you do that, I think that the theme of the LLAS thing and popular religion in Latin America, and we'll see other manifestations of that, this was about as positive an experience of the people's religion as you could have. Tony's not here from my floor, is he? I say I haven't been to El Salvador in 5 years, and Antonio Vasquez Serrano, is a Salvadoran, moved to LA for high school. His mom didn't want him to be at the mercy of the gangs in El Salvador, so they moved to LA, where there's no gangs, in South LA. But they were coming here early. He was going on the college-bound trip, the rock climbing trip, and I get this cell phone call. I was trying to do that, and I had found out he's from El Salvador, and his mom and grandma are coming with him. They got dropped off behind Emmaus Hall. They don't know, everything's closed. It's 5:15, 5:30 at night. I get a cell phone call. I go walking over there, kind of looking around, and there's these two Salvadoran women about this tall. Okay, they turn around and see me. I say, "Soy hermano Dennis," and I just get this huge, big hug. And it was like, okay, I'm just back there. I'm back in the campo. So that's kind of been my experiences. They just embrace people. It's very hard to say no to them. It's like, "Well, you're coming back, aren't you?" And it's like, yeah, I'm coming back. So I find an excuse. I thought I probably should have organized a trip for this spring, but didn't. I've got a kind of an agenda that's fairly full, so it's not happening, but maybe someday. I've thought of doing a June term trip. You don't want to go in May because, well, it's even late April. If the rainy season hasn't started, everybody's dying for it to start because it's so hot and humid. And then it starts and it rains the rest of May like crazy. And then it kind of eases up in June. And at least during most of the day, it's nice and sunny and hot, and then a huge thunderstorm will blow through about 4 o'clock in the afternoon and something like that. But you can deal with that. But if all-day rain would be a little bit hard. So, and it's not the safest country in the world, as Edwin could tell you. Go ahead. I think Pope Francis is pushing as hard as he can. And it's hard to overcome old resistances. When Mary Geller went in 1999, when she was in high school, they had an exchange student living with them from El Salvador. Exchange student was living with them when the Civil War broke out. She couldn't go home. She lived with them for 3 years or more. She went to college in the U.S. So Mary's down there in El Salvador, and she says, "Well, we're all leaving. The trip's done. We're going to the airport." She's going to meet her old host sister, or guest sister, and go and visit the family. But the family was a wealthy family. Their daughter was studying in the U.S. And the older brothers of this sister, who was, learned a different perspective in the U.S., they asked Mary, what'd you do? Oh, we visited where Romero's grave and where Romero was killed and stuff like that. They said, I hated that man. When his voice came on the radio, I just wanted to scream. It was everything I could do to not just take out a gun and shoot the radio. Really, and so people have said that there are still people there who get polarized by some of the stuff. It was really frightening for her after a week, 10 days of just real positive kinds of things to experience that really negative stuff. So in Rome, I'm not sure what it was. The person who wrote for John Paul II the two statements against liberation theology was Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict. I think he had to move on before Romero's cause was going to go anywhere. But Francis is not going to give up. I mean, Francis was not like the way Francis is all the time. And I think he really admires someone like Romero. And their identification that this should be a church of the poor, they're absolutely on the same page there. Yeah. Maybe one more.
What is, can you explain the process again for how steps you have to do to become a saint?
Very briefly, because I'm one of those people that I don't get too hung up on that. People ask me, is he going to become a saint or not? I said, he is a saint. They can catch up. The church can catch up if they want to. And the Salvadorans, most of them are the same way. I think, we have that boy saint in the basement of the church here, St. Peregrine. And I'm enough of I'm a philosophy teacher, I'm a skeptic on certain things. Maybe I know too much different language. I said, Peregrine is Latin for pilgrim. And stranger, you don't know who the guy is. So it's like, the body's from the catacombs. I absolutely believe that. But it's like, anybody know who this guy is? No? Okay, we put this passerby. was caught up in the cat. And so I kind of, I think, and it clearly, the identification, this is about a 14-year-old boy, etc. That's all great. Why is he in the catacombs? He was clearly one of the Christians, etc. The stories of him serving in the emperor's court and stuff like that, it's like, you found a skeleton and you inferred that he was doing that? I mean, where's the basis for that? And those stories came from Austria? Oh, I guess they had a hidden thing to Rome back then. But I sort of do the same thing with this. With the causes are people have to claim miracles. And there are lots of miracles claimed. And I'm not a disbeliever in miracles, but I'm enough of a skeptic to say, oh, people want to believe in miracles. I think it's kind of hard to separate them. I think the miracle is, he is alive, resurrected. The faith of the Salvadoran people, and one of the things, I think there's a couple of people that were able to attend the talk last year, and I use John Sobrino a lot. John Sobrino says El Salvador's biggest export is faith. Because people who are skeptics go to El Salvador and they come back and say, I'm going to go to church. My faith is alive, kind of thing. And to me, those are the kinds of things that are... Now, is that a miracle where you say someone had cancer and now they don't have it? Can you document it? I don't know. But that's one of the things they're doing is... Now, the question on the martyr, if he's officially declared a martyr, they don't need the evidence of the miracles. But there's part of me that thinks that this is a game that's being played. He's a saint. You would have been better chance of becoming a saint if you lived in the Middle Ages, because they just looked at how good people's lives were and they made you a saint. So there's some of the technicalities of it. I think it's where the church turns into an institution and a bureaucracy and gets a little bit... it'll catch up. It's a flawed... it's a human institution, so it's got those things. But the truth it has, I don't think, is flawed. The institution itself sometimes has some flaws, okay? They say we have the treasure in earthen vessels, and that's the kind of thing that we've got, in my mind. So. Okay, probably should, okay, thank you.